Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Florida Native Plant Society Lunch and Learn. It is July, so today's our July Lunch and Learn. I'm pleased to have Crandall, PhD, who just disappeared and is now back. She presented at a conference, had a lovely presentation. However, we were unable to record it because it was in one of the second ballrooms. So she's graciously agreed to present it to us again. If you appreciate our Lunch and Learns, please make sure you're a member of the Florida Native Plant Society. We have 31 chapters throughout the state, and they're really fun, dynamic organizations, and your membership goes to support their activities and also our programming here. We can bring Ray in. All right, Ray, take it away.
Val, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this presentation again. If you did see it during the Florida Native Plant Society conference, this one is a little bit different. I added slightly more information based on some of the questions that I received after the talk, but the main message is still the same. So let's talk about exploring Florida's old growth grasslands, and they're probably just right under your feet. And sorry, here we go. So when I say old growth, most people think of forests. They think of these huge, large, majestic trees. They might be in the redwoods out in California, or we do have some old growth pine in Florida at the Wade Tract up near Tall Timbers Research Station. And this is typically what we think about. We look up when we think about old growth and we think about the overstory. But I think we don't give enough credit to our understory, which is pretty old in most places. And old growth savannas, when we think about them, we really need to look under our feet. We need to look at the ground. These are often open ecosystems that have been maintained with fire. And so they experience regular disturbances in terms of fire, but not with soil disturbance. And so when we think of old growth trees, we think of trees that haven't been harvested or cut. But when we think about old growth grasslands, when we're looking to the understory, we're thinking of ecosystems that haven't experienced a soil disturbance. And so they haven't been tilled, for example. And we do know that once we do create a soil disturbance, once we're doing something like tilling or disrupting the soil in these systems, we get a very different community. And you'll probably notice dog fennel is one of the most common species that you'll get in this instance, but other things like love grass and those like ruderal early successional species. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about how we identify old growth open ecosystems, and then also present some research that shows you how some of the most dominant species in this system have demographic stability. And then I'll finish up with some research that is ongoing, it's not published yet, about plant communities and whether plant communities are stable. So first, just some general information about the old growth grasslands and some of the characteristics of old growth grasslands. First, they do have small scale disturbances. So think like gopher tortoise burrows and things like that, but not these larger scale soil disturbances that we would expect with tilling or the such. They're generally nutrient poor. These are acidic soils, usually spodosols or entosols, and they're just not good in general at holding nutrients. And then some nutrients volatilize quite quickly with fire, and they don't reaccumulate very quickly. Like nitrogen is a really good example of that. But we often don't find much phosphorus and calcium and nitrogen and such in these soils, and it's natural for these soils. Most old growth savannas will have some level of seasonal flooding. So you may not see water necessarily above ground, pooling, but we have these distinct wet and dry seasons. We're in the wet season right now. You probably have to plan your bike ride home from work to make sure you don't get caught in rain. And so it's this time of year when we have those rains occurring where our water table rises significantly, meaning sometimes we do see water above ground, but differences in where the water table is located. And then, of course, these open ecosystems need frequent fire in order to maintain the low tree density that makes them so open. And we know fires are really important for maintaining these open grass tree structures. Fires vary in frequency across the southeastern US, and there's certainly different frequencies for different ecosystem types within the southeastern US. So we have flatwoods and we have sandhills and we have scrub habitats. These are all more open ecosystems, but they vary slightly in the frequency of fire that's required to maintain their characteristic structure. Most of these fires are really low in intensity. You can see here with this prescribed fire, flame lengths are only a foot or two, if that, moving through these mostly grassy fuels with some shrubs. Bunchgrasses are a defining feature of southeastern US pine savannas, and we have multiple bunchgrass species that dominate depending on the ecosystem type. But there are some basic characteristics and relationships between these bunch grasses and the frequent fires that we know we need to maintain these open ecosystems. Bunch grasses have really thin, needle-like leaves. They dry out and cure really quickly. And so they help spread fire. I also think of bunch grasses, kind of like wiregrass. They have these leaves that sort of flop over. And so one plant is pretty easily connected to another plant, and that helps spread fire. And we think of these bunch grasses in their relationship with fire as maintaining a fuel fire feedback. And what that means is that fires occur and they promote these species. They're adapted to fire. So, we see a fire occurring there on the left-hand side. At the top, we see wiregrass that's regrowing on the left side. Then we see that wiregrass that's cured and dried. And so it carries fire really well. And it creates then this cycle or this feedback loop or fuel fire feedback that keeps our fires able to move pretty frequently through these understory systems. Fires also maintain really high plant species richness. So many of you may know that we're in the coastal plain floristic province, and this is a hotspot of biodiversity. And that hotspot of biodiversity is partly because of the fire that's maintaining such high species richness. If we move from the more ecosystem level and thinking about patterns of precipitation and nutrients, and we look at the plant communities and the communities that we find in these open ecosystems, we find species that don't occur in secondary grasslands. And so we don't find species that might be present, like dog fennel, that might be present after a soil disturbance. As I mentioned, we're in a hotspot of biodiversity, really high herbaceous species richness and diversity. We also have communities that have persistent bud banks and also transient seed banks. And so we have seed banks that can persist for longer periods of time, but most of our plants, majority of our plants actually have below ground systems. They're geoxyles or often have more biomass below ground than above ground. And that helps them resprout really quickly after fire. They're using those below ground systems to store carbohydrates and nutrients that help them regrow pretty quickly. So it's that high below ground biomass that also helps maintain these species rich communities in open ecosystems. So then if we go, done ecosystem, talked about the high species richness, and then if we go to thinking about individual species, what species do we find in old growth grasslands, and what are their life histories? How do they behave in these systems? So I mentioned the below ground bud bank, and so most of them are resprouting. They have buds that are below ground or buds that are protected so that they aren't killed by fire. Now, a really great example of this is saw palmetto. So I did a study with a student where we took these little thermocouples that measure fire temperature. We put them outside of saw palmetto, and then we put them just in the tip, right where the bud is. So you know how like palmetto palms kind of grow out right in that tip. We put a thermocouple, and we didn't find much change in temperature at all right inside the tip of the plant. So it's a really good insulator and protects those buds. So another great example would be longleaf pine. We all know it has this, grass stage where the needles buffer that apical bud from high fire temperature. We also know they live a really long time. Saw palmetto has been dated to 12, 13,000 years old. So, a lot of these plants, we don't even know how old they are or how long they've persisted in some of these areas. Some of them have fire-stimulated flowering. So wiregrass is a great example of that. You burn late May, early June, and you're going to get flowering right around Thanksgiving time. Underground storage units, as we mentioned before, with the community. But this one is interesting. The last one, they also have low seedling establishment. And so, in studies that we've done of saw palmetto and of wiregrass, we don't find much seedling recruitment at all. We studied saw palmetto for probably 3 or 4 years, and I think we found one seedling. So they're pretty rare in terms of establishment in already existing communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with some specific examples. So moving into one of the studies that we've done, we realized that people had said a lot about how populations of wiregrass are really stable. And I'm talking about demographic stability. So your recruitment and then death of individuals basically are equal. So the population isn't growing or shrinking. So you think of like births and deaths being equal. And really they hadn't been measured. They'd really just been assumed. And so we wanted to start a study where we looked at how wiregrass behaves in these old growth ecosystems and see really how stable is their demography. And we expected most locally dominant species to be demographically stable, meaning that they're really not changing much over time, and that new recruitment, new individuals are replacing those that have died over time. And these species, they're so dominant that you will find them. This is average percent cover in 1 by 1 meter plots. This is at Avon Park bombing range. And we examined some long-term data to look at really how dominant these species are, even across variation in elevation. And we found that saw palmetto and wiregrass and then dwarf live oak Quercus minima were some of the most common species, with 16%, 20%, and 24% average across hundreds of 1 by 1 meter square plots. So to examine demographic stability of these dominant plant species, we looked at 2 different data sets. In the first one, we looked at the abundance of dominant species in different open ecosystems over time. And in the second one, we really narrowed in on the population demography of wiregrass. And we looked at it under variable fire regimes, so differences in fire frequency and seasonality, to see really how stable they are. I want to be clear first that when we did the demography, this was at Austin Carey Forest, Ordway-Swisher Biological Station, and the Loch Lusa Wildlife Management Area managed by St. John's River Water Management District. All of these, Avon Park, they're all within the range of Aristida beyrichiana. We can argue taxonomy another time between Aristida beyrichiana and Aristida stricta, but I just wanted to be clear about where these studies are sort of coming from, all within the Gulf, the coastal plain. So we looked at demography in 3 sites, and then when we looked at the abundances and changes in abundance of dominant species, we did that at the Avon Park Air Force Range. So let's start first by looking at that Avon Park data. And so these species were dominant. They, on average, had 16 to 24% cover in all of our 1 by 1 meter plots. And we looked at areas that were classified with different soil wetness. So we had dry to mesic soils, mesic or sort of wet soils, then really pretty wet soils, and then super wet soils. So that's the range there from dry mesic over to wet. We looked at all of the species that we found, but I want to really focus in on 3 of them here. That's wiregrass or Aristida beyrichiana, the Quercus minima, and then the Serenua repens. and look at how these have changed over time. These data were collected at a consistent time since fire, and overall different areas were sampled between 1995 and in some cases all the way up to 2015. But like I said, they were only sampled after fire, so you see some variation there in when these data were collected. I also note there's a little bit of a jitter there where I kind of nudged points in either direction if they were overlapping. So I want you to look at the axis here, because you're probably looking at this and saying, whoa, like things are kind of bouncing up and down and they're moving all around. But the differences that we're seeing, this is mean relative percent cover. We're not seeing even up to 0.5% cover between any plant samplings. So this is an extremely low amount of variation that's occurring over time in these systems that are burned pretty frequently. So I think the message here is that really the cover is not changing. They're staying really stable over time in terms of the amount of these species that's in the plots, as measured by percent cover. So the other study we did was in 3 different areas where we tagged individual plants, and we tagged well over 1,000 plants that we surveyed for about 5 years. So you can imagine I had students out all during the fall, going out measuring wiregrass. We quantified whether or not they were reproductive or not. We collected the seeds and we germinated them. And we used all of these different data to put them into a demographic model. Now you'll see I have population growth rate, or lambda, that's over on the x-axis. And all I'm saying there is whether or not the population has increased or the population has decreased. So if you have a lambda of 1, it means the population is neither growing or shrinking, and it's demographically stable. We did this study in dry areas and more mesic areas. So the dry areas were sandhill pine savannas, the mesic ones were flatwoods pine savannas. We had fire frequencies from every year all the way up to every 3 years. And we also burned during different months. So the 1 there would be January, the 6 would be June. And so we wanted to know if there was even any interaction or change over time if you vary fire frequency or if you vary the seasonality of fire. So that was a long explanation for 6 graphs that basically show nothing is happening because nothing varies from 1. I'm not even showing you error bars here if you're into statistics and such, because the error bars were so minuscule that essentially everything is equal to 1. And look at the scale here too. The scale is really narrow. What we're basically seeing here is almost everything is completely demographically stable. The populations just are not changing. The one that you do see that's it's like 1.07 or whatnot, that's because we had 1 seedling in 1 year that recruited that increased the population size and then gave us a higher population growth rate. So one question I often get is, they have really high survival, but did you see any die over the course of the study? Like, what was the mortality? And I say, well, yeah, we had like 2 die in 1 site, and that's because of this tree that fell over on some of our wiregrass plants, and they did not survive being smothered for a long period of time by a tree. So you'll see then that, or infer that there have to be some really extenuating circumstances to have wiregrass not survive. And I think that's common of a lot of our really dominant species. There are a few things that we learned while we were studying wiregrass. This one might not be surprising to you, that fire season does affect wiregrass reproduction. If you burn during the winter or January or thereabouts, often these plants will not produce seeds. Every now and then they will produce some seeds, but they don't germinate. If you burn in the spring, so like March or thereabouts, we actually find that they produce more of those flowering culms above the plant, but those seeds actually have really low germination. If you burn during the summer or June, you'll find less culm production than you would if you burned in the spring, but more of those seeds actually germinate. And so you get a higher seed yield overall of seeds that are filled and capable of germinating. We also learned that fire frequency affects wiregrass reproduction. We had some sites that had been burned every 3 years for 30 years or so, and they produced filled seeds with high germination. We also have another site, it's at Austin Cary Forest, that's burned every year, and it's been burned every single year since the 1970s. And these seeds in most years were like dust. They weren't even whole seeds. You would touch them and they would just fall apart. And so we do think it's possible to burn too frequently in these systems. So for instance, if you were harvesting seed for a restoration project, you're probably not going to want to burn every year and expect to collect seeds that are filled and able to germinate in your restoration project. We looked and looked and looked. We put seeds out in the field in these intact old growth savannas, and we didn't see any germination. We think that, you know, this might be related to the soil community, and we've done a little testing on the microbes and fungi in soil. It could also be related to the self-thinning that wiregrass does as it becomes established. But really, wiregrass recruitment in all of our studies was only observed in areas that had been tilled and planted. And this corresponds also with a study that we did where wiregrass is more likely to establish and grows bigger in soil that's been disturbed. So once again, it could be related to the microbes or fungi that are in the soil. But generally speaking, in a system that has really stable populations that aren't growing and they're not shrinking, you don't need a lot of new establishment to keep those populations at the same size. So if you have 1 and 2 individuals that die every 100 years, I'm just making up data, you know, you would only need 1 new seedling every 100 years. We also discovered some really cool things. The wiregrass and other dominant species will often persist a really long time, even in these unburned systems that aren't quite as open anymore. An undergraduate student in my lab made this cool observation that if you kind of kick around some of the pine needles from the trees, wiregrass is still under there. And in fact, if you burn it, it comes right back as if it has been burned all along, and even reproduces in that first year after reintroducing fire to areas. So, you know, this is sort of a positive in terms of restoration where, you know, it might be good to consider what you already have there and whether you can do restoration without doing a ton of soil disturbance. And I think that's the direction that many people are moving in. So overall, I showed you data mostly from 3 different species where we're really providing evidence for the persistence or this demographic stability of these dominant species under very widely different fire regimes that vary in both seasonality and frequency. And, you know, I will say, you know, these species aren't alone, and wiregrass is not alone in terms of having demographic stability, and not just in our southeastern US, not just in Florida, but also in other ecosystems. So, you know, in the southeastern US, we've found demographic stability of wiregrass, Aristida beyrichiana, but also drop seeds, Parabolis gentius. In Belize, we've also found their open ecosystems have also these really dominant species. And ironically, we studied Mesocetum filifolium, which is also called wiregrass. It has the same common name. And then Paspalum pectinatum, which doesn't have a good common name. And these species are also really stable. And so these are some, you know, potentially defining characteristics of old growth grasslands, that they have these species that are dominant and they persist over a long time And even with some variation, not huge variation, but some variation in the fire regime from seasonality and frequency, they remain stable within these systems. So when I say demographic stability, I'm talking about one species, or in this case, a group of a few different species. But we can say, oh, okay, well, if these are dominant, if these dominant species are stable, are our communities stable? And I've been asked this question quite a bit, and it's actually the topic of a Department of Energy grant that we're working on now, where we're looking at multiple long-term plant community data sets and examining whether the community as a whole, not just the dominant species, but whether the entire community is changing over time with variation in the fire regime. We've just started this study, so this is sort of hot off the presses data that hasn't been published yet, but I wanted to share it with you because I think it's really interesting. What we find is unlike populations of dominant species, our plant communities are not stable. They are stable within different fire regimes, but not stable over time. So what I'm showing you here, this is a multivariate analysis, and all you really need to know from this is that points that are more close together have communities that are more similar. And in this study, this ranged from 1980 actually to 2018. And different plots were either not burned, they were burned every 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. And we see them sort of group along those fire regimes where the ones that are burned more frequently occur sort of at one end of the plot, and at the other corner, we see the areas that are burned less frequently. Now you'll notice there's 2 ellipses here, a green one and a blue one. And that's where we really see this distinct break in the communities, and it is a significant break in the communities where after 2000, the communities shift significantly. They're becoming different. And so we started investigating what might be some of the explanations for this distinct shift in the communities. And the first thing we did is looked at patterns of soil moisture over time, the PDSI. And what we find is if you look from the 1980 to 2000, you see a lot of the gray bars that are going up. That means they're fairly wet years. But then if you go from 2000 to 2018, you'll see there are a lot of droughts. And this is monthly data. So you'll see some bars moving up. That's more of a wet season. But the dry seasons are becoming significantly drier. And even some years, there really isn't much of a wet season or a wetter part of the year. And we think that this significant shift that we're seeing is actually related to drought. And like I said, we're still working on this and we have more data sets to analyze. It'll be interesting to see if this pattern sort of comes out with different data sets. But I wanted to make it clear that even though our dominant species are remaining stable, there are some less dominant species. There are some rare species that are becoming rarer or even kind of blipping out of these populations because of changes that we see overall. I know climate change is a bad thing to say right now, but I think what we're seeing here is definitely a pattern where the climate is changing in across the southeastern US, and it's causing a shift in our plant communities. So when you read papers about old growth grasslands, we're often not included. People don't talk about the southeastern US. And we know that we have a lot of grasslands and that we have our longleaf pine grasslands and open ecosystems in the southeastern US. If you look at the graph that's over on the right-hand side, you'll see a graph that's relating the rainfall to the annual temperature range. And all of those yellow points, those are North America longleaf pine savannas. We're weirdos here. We don't fit on the graph. We don't follow that trend. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we've often been left out of these global studies. But honestly, we're not the only ones that haven't been studied to a large extent. There are other ecosystems or open ecosystems in Vietnam, in the Philippines, even in Belize, that really have not had much published on them or much research that's been done. And when we're seeing such significant shifts in community, to me, it tells me that it's a really critical time for us to really document what we have on Earth and to understand how it's operating so that we can think about this in the future as our climate and our ecosystems change. So I just want to put in a couple of plugs here. If you want to know more about fire in the South, certainly consider checking out Southern Fire Exchange. I'm the principal investigator of Southern Fire Exchange. We offer fact sheets, recorded webinars on our YouTube channel, and other resources to help you learn more about fire in the southeastern US. If you're really interested in wiregrass and you want to know more specifically about wiregrass, come check out our wiregrass blog. You can go to ecologionfire.com. You can get my email address there. You can get more information on wiregrass also. And with that, just a big thank you to all the individuals here who helped with fieldwork and analyses and such, but also to the Florida Native Plant Society for inviting me to speak today. It's such an honor. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Looks like we do have a few questions. Our first one.
Oh, Val, you're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. I'm just muted for you, not for them. So they heard all that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, very exciting technical situation. Just want to say welcome to, we've got folks from the Florida Forest Service, folks from Eugenia chapter, folks from Suncoast chapter. So it's a nice big group we have here. Louise had a question about the wiregrass population graph that you had up, the one with the purple circles. If you could go back to
it. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to just flip back. Normally I would go to the slide sort, but it's okay. Sorry about this. Okay, this one?
that one, yes. She says she doesn't understand it, and it looks to her that since 2000 there were no populations except in mesic wet places.
Since
2000.
Oh no.
Maybe
Okay.
the graph before that.
Not this one.
One before that.
This one.
Yes.
Yeah. So this one, since 2000, the dry mesic had a couple of samplings, but they needed to catch it right after fire. So some of these they didn't catch at their time since fire. So yeah, we are certainly lacking a little bit here. But I will also tell you that the other study was not this one. This was in a different area. So I would need to pull for this one the PDSI, the drought indices for this one, to really be able to relate it to drought. So let's be careful comparing the two studies because they're in different areas and had different objectives.
Okay, thank you. And Brenda Briel asks, have you looked at biotic factors like granivores, herbivores, and pathogens?
Not yet. I mean, that's certainly a place to go in the future. And we're also, we're using often in terms of these larger studies, other people's data. So it's sort of what's available to us. In terms of wiregrass, we've looked at production of smut. We've looked at pollination and how pollination differs across different areas, although they're mostly wind pollinated. So we've looked at some other various factors. We've looked at herbivory with wiregrass also and find that it does produce more seeds if we cage them so that they can't be, so nothing's munching on them.
I think, so this question is about tree pruning. But so your areas aren't in areas where the trees are, these study areas, the trees aren't pruned in like a residential way, right?
No, they're not. And so these are mostly longleaf or slash pine. And I always say they sort of self prune, right, as they grow. So no pruning is done.
So I think maybe Catherine is asking if the pruning of trees in suburban areas, like our recent decrease in tree canopy throughout Florida due to insurance issues and other legislative issues, if that could be influencing rainfall or if it's just a broader climatic issue.
I think it's either a broader climatic issue, or I have had someone mention that it could be more related to agricultural drawdown. So, I think those are directions we might think about pursuing in the future.
Thanks. Tim Barrett asks, why are the grasslands not recognized?
Because we just don't fall on the line. Like, our systems are slightly different, and so they're just not as recognized. We've seen paper after paper after paper come in of these global studies of open grasslands, and we're just not on there. And once again, I think it's just because we have some differences in rainfall and temperature that aren't similar to those other open ecosystems, but it just makes us more special, right? But I think including us in more of these studies would really help us understand these ecosystems much better.
Awesome. Jovan asks, how does the old growth concept alter ecological succession as we've been taught?
So, yeah, I mean, most of our successional diagrams, they show a disturbance occurs and we move our system, back to a previous state, and then it begins succession again. And we now know that a lot of those original successional ideas, Henry Chandler Cowles was the one who originally came up with this. They're much different. In our systems, what we have are these feedbacks that mean that we don't have true successional stages. It's only when we remove the disturbance that we see a significant change in our communities, other than changes in like climate and such. There's a great paper by Jen Phil in 2015 where she really tries to debunk a lot of those old successional ideas and redevelop succession for longleaf pine savannas and other frequently burned habitats.
I took a modeling class once, not like modeling, but like, ecological modeling. And the professor said, all models are wrong, but all models are applicable at some points to some points.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have Linda Cooper asks if there's a reason why Austin Carey is burned yearly, and then John Johnson pops in that it's a demonstration site they utilize for classes and training opportunities.
Yeah, we have sites that are burned during the summer every year, every 2 years, and every 3 years, and then also sites that are burned during the winter every year, every 2 years, and every 3 years. And so we took advantage of some of those demonstration sites, not all of them, for our study.
Awesome. Ecosphere 101 asks, I'm a little late, sorry if you answered this. Is grazing a viable alternative to using fire in maintaining wiregrass?
So I would not say grazing. Overall, grazing changes the relative dominance of different species and even grasses, C3 and C4 grasses. And so I don't think grazing can replace fire, just to give you the simple answer.
Catherine Booth asks, have your findings helped fire managers better manage how often they are performing prescribed fire?
I think that our prescribed burn managers understand how important fire is, and the frequency. And I think it's pretty rare that fires become too frequent, right? That they're continually happening every year. The fact that we had this site that was burned every year at Austin Carey Forest was great for this study, but I know of maybe one other area that's burned every year in this region, like locally to Gainesville, and it's just not very common. So I think our fire practitioners are doing a great job, and don't necessarily need this to show them that they're doing a great job and they know what they're doing out there.
Awesome. Well, that covers all of our questions that have been popped in the chat so far. Um, Folks, I believe everybody.
If
Go ahead.
anyone's welcome to email me or contact me if they have additional questions. Always happy to answer anything.
Yeah, and if you don't have hers or want to go through me, communications@mps.org. I think everybody has my email address. Yeah, so this was excellent. We've gotten some thank yous and great presentations in the comments.
My pleasure. Any opportunity to talk about our open ecosystems.
It's very important. Go enjoy your nearby well-burned pine savanna when you can. Oh, we have one last one from Jovan. Let's just squeeze it in.
Sure.
He would like to know if early successional habitat is outdated, if it's an outdated term.
No, it's not, because we still do have early successional communities where we've had a soil disturbance. So that's often where you're going to find, dog fennel and, greater density of things like andropogons and stuff. So yeah, they still certainly exist. And I do think we need more information about how these secondary grasslands transition into, old growth grasslands, or if they ever do. But I think that terminology is still relevant. I just don't think that we can take these ecosystems like the old growth grasslands and apply that in terms of how our fire operates, because fire operates here much differently with that fire fuel feedback than it does in other areas.
Well said. Thank you. So the schedule for Lunch and Learns is pretty stacked. We have one next month with Jordan Parker, aka JP Charisma. That's landscaping focused. He'll be going over butterfly landscaping with an example from a Central South Florida, 1 or 2 Central South Florida yards. And then I'm booked out through November. So look for the schedule announcement and registration links coming to your inbox. And please, we've already gotten one new member from this Lunch and Learn. Thank you, Kevin and Allison. Really appreciate you guys. I'll pop that link again in the chat. And yeah, support your local chapter. Go out in your grasslands. And thank you so much, Ray. It's great.
You're welcome.